On the 1st of June 1807, an extraordinary auction took place here at Rycote Park in Oxfordshire. Weighed down by mounting financial problems, the 5th Earl of Abingdon took the drastic decision to demolish his country mansion and sell it off brick by brick. It was an ignominious end for a house which had once entertained kings and queens and dominated the Oxfordshire political landscape. All that survives today is this part of the southwest tower. The mansion that was demolished in 1807 was a Tudor creation built at some point between the early to mid-16th century. The identity of its builder, however, remains a mystery. Having demolished the mansion, the 5th Earl deemed the house archive to be of no further value and threw it onto a bonfire. The story of the mansion and its owning families faded into historical obscurity. This early 18th century view of Rycote showed us the sheer scale of the mansion, its formal gardens, service buildings and surrounding parkland. I'm stood roughly inside what would have been the Great Hall of the mansion, overlooking the courtyard and gatehouse. As grave as the loss of the mansion archive is, a house of the importance of Rycote cannot have fully disappeared from the historical record. Traces of Rycote's past are preserved in a variety of archival collections, many of which are to be found in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. 3 years of research has identified over 400 items, ranging from letters to accounts of royal visits, in more than 50 different Bodleian collections formed by antiquaries, families and historical figures. The key to discovering much of this material has been identifying Rycote's owners. Traditionally, archives and their catalogues have been formed around people. One of the key sources for the ownership of Rycote has been this 18th century manuscript history compiled by a local clergyman named Thomas Delafield. It's certainly not the most glamorous of the Rycote discoveries, but it is one of the most important. Although it says little about the mansion itself as seen in Delafield's day, it contains detailed information about Rycote's owners from the medieval period to the mid-18th century. It's not without its inaccuracies and gaps, but it provides a foundation from which much else can be built. But sometimes, uncovering information can be more about following a hunch. This is very much the case with this manuscript, which contains accounts of noblemen's funerals, 1557 to 1568. One of the funerals it records is that of John, Baron Williams of Thame, who purchased Rycote in 1539 and is a strong candidate for having built the Tudor mansion. Williams died in October 1559, so it seemed plausible that his funeral might be included here. It turned out to be one of the few manuscripts that takes us inside the 16th century mansion. It describes how William's body was brought to Rycote, where amidst of the great chamber he was laid, and thereon a large pool of black velvet containing 24 yards, with a cross of white satin of 8 yards. Rycote's place in national history is best illustrated through its royal connections. It was the home of families prominent in political and military circles, and between 1540 and 1683 staged numerous royal entertainments. 6 English monarchs honoured Rycote with their presence. The first was Henry VIII, who visited with his new bride Catherine Howard in August 1540. But of all the monarchs who came to Rycote, it is Henry's daughter Elizabeth I whose attachment was the strongest. Her first visit, however, occurred in less than august circumstances. In April 1554, she stopped at Rycote on her way to Woodstock as a prisoner of her half-sister, Queen Mary, under suspicion of complicity in a rebellion. In happier times, Elizabeth was entertained at Rycote as Queen on 4 occasions during her reign. This manuscript details some of the expenses involved in preparing Rycote for the Queen's visit in August 1570. Amongst the works described here are charges for carpenters occupied not only in damming up of doors and windows and mending of floors, as also in making of presses and tables for the robes and mending of the stairs. At the time of this visit, Rycote was the home of Sir Henry Norris and his wife Marjorie. The Norrises enjoyed a warm relationship with Elizabeth. Sir Henry's father had been caught up in the downfall of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, and Elizabeth affectionately nicknamed Marjorie "mine own crow" on account of her dark complexion. In 1572, she advanced Sir Henry to the peerage as Baron Norris of Rycote. The Norrises were famed for their 6 valiant and warlike soldiers' sons. Of the 6 Norris brothers of Rycote, it was the second son, Sir John, who achieved the greatest renown both at home and abroad. In this letter of 21st June 1594, the Queen writes to congratulate him upon the reduction of a Spanish fort threatening Brest in Brittany. Sir John was then commanding an English army in Brittany, sent by the Queen to aid King Henry IV of France. Elizabeth writes, "Trusty and well-beloved, we greet you well, and do praise and thank Almighty God for the continuance of his favours towards us in all our actions of any moment against our enemies, and now especially for this late victory given by the service and direction of you as our general, and by other our valiant captains and soldiers, by whose manhood and valour the proud Spaniard was vanquished." Rycote's royal connections continued on into the 17th century with entertainments for James I and then his son Charles I. Charles came here in July 1625 when the first parliament of his reign was moved to Oxford following an outbreak of the plague in London. We definitely know that Charles spent 2 days here at Rycote, the 30th and 31st of July, on which day the King issued this proclamation from the court at Rycote. This spectacular dome pew is said to have been installed for the King's use.
The present chapel at Rycote was built by Sir Richard Quatermain and his wife Sybil Englefield, who inherited the estate in 1415. It was consecrated in 1449 and it served as their private chapel. Towards the end of their life, they endowed it with money so that it became their chantry, where priests said masses and prayed for their souls once they were dead. It's architecturally important because it was built at one time and remains largely unaltered. And we're very fortunate to have the magnificent wagon roof, the original pews and choir stalls, the font base and cover, and many of the floor tiles remain in situ. But it was at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century when a set of fabulous furnishings and fittings were installed for the Norris family and their royal guests. So we have the box pews painted and gilded, we have the musicians' loft, the new pulpit and the large West Gallery, all treated with a theatrical paint scheme of blue sky, clouds and gold stars. In 1682, the first Earl of Abingdon laid the black and white marble floor and created the great Baroque reredos that we see today. The chapel sits in a wonderful parkland setting next to the ancient yew tree, said to have been planted in 1135.
The history of Rycote is captured in a network of archival sources which bring to life early modern Oxfordshire. One of the key sources for 17th century Oxfordshire, and indeed earlier, is the collection amassed by the Oxford antiquary Anthony Wood. Wood was a zealous chronicler of the times in which he lived and has left us rich accounts of the role of James Barty, 1st Earl of Abingdon, and Rycote in the Oxfordshire political landscape. The Earl of Abingdon was a direct descendant of Henry, 1st Baron Norris of Rycote. Rycote had passed into the possession of the Barty family in 1648. Abingdon was the dominant political force in Oxfordshire during the last quarter of the 17th century. Under his ownership, Rycote regularly hosted entertainments staged by the City of Oxford and the university for visiting royalty and other dignitaries. This account by Wood describes the Earl of Abingdon's work in Oxford to secure the county during the rebellion of the Duke of Monmouth against James II in 1685. He records that upon the defeat of the rebellion in Somerset, the Earl invited the university troop to a celebratory dinner at Rycote. Wood writes that the troopers came home well fuzzed. For Rycote, the 18th century was an era of decline. Late on the night of 12th November 1745, a devastating fire took hold of the mansion, destroying much of the building. The fire also claimed the life of the 3rd Earl of Abingdon's son and heir, the 10-year-old James Lord Norris. Despite a myth which some histories have mistakenly perpetuated, Rycote was rebuilt and refurbished. This episode in the mansion's history, perhaps more than any other, demonstrates the crucial need always to examine carefully contemporary sources against traditions which may have been embellished over time. This engraving of 1783 depicts a remodelled house complete with Georgian Gothic windows. Financially, the family's fortunes spiraled out of control, the rebuilding of Rycote perhaps adding further strain. The 4th Earl of Abingdon's finances became so dire that he was forced to sell off the contents of the mansion. As we can see from this sale catalogue of 1779, everything from mattresses to Van Dyck portraits was up for grabs. The fourth Earl of Abingdon was a man of eccentric character, and his spending habits only exacerbated his family's financial plight.
Profligacy seems certainly to have been part of the territory for the 18th century English aristocrat. And in this respect, Willoughby Barty, 4th Earl of Abingdon, certainly did not let the side down. We know that, for instance, he paid out £5,000 simply to improve his mansion in readiness for his wedding. But the other loves of his life were music, for which we know, or we're told at least, he spent £1,600 in sponsoring the famous London concert series organised by Bach and Abel. And his other real love was horse racing. There is an autobiographical poem called Adieu to the Turf. Well, it may be autobiographical, but I suspect actually it's spoof. It's a spurious poem written tongue-in-cheek as if by the Earl himself. Horse racing, it must be remembered, and this fits in with the Earl's political views, was a democratic institution, bringing together, as he said, all the social classes in one common cause. And this is really the man's political persona.
The fourth Earl's financial situation never improved, and by the time of his death in September 1799, his affairs were in complete disarray. The Tudor mansion became a luxury which his family could simply no longer afford. The demolition of the mansion, coupled with the burning of its archive in June 1807, has left us many unanswered questions. Some, such as the identity of its builder, we may never be able to definitively answer. Yet the diverse range of letters, diaries, maps and accounts which have survived in other collections afford us many tantalising glimpses into life at one of Oxfordshire's greatest homes.